Well, today's episode, I'm going to talk about, let's talk about escapes. I pull up Corrections 1. I see several articles there about escapes. Pull up Fox News, MSNBC. It seems like there's been an escape on the front page of, the news outlets for several weeks now. So let's talk a little bit about how we've gotten to this point where there's multiple escapes going on at the same time. Is it just the news, or is there something going on? And I'll tell you, I think that we are kind of in the middle of the perfect storm. There's several things going on. I think right now that the respect for law enforcement is at an all-time low. I think recruitment and retention is very tough right now. I think a lot of agencies have lowered their standards. They're looking for a body to fill that 8 hours sometimes, and we may not be getting the same level of officer that we've had in the past. I think you've got a vacuum of leadership going on in our prisons. A lot of people, to include me, I put in my 29 years and it was time to go out the door, but a lot of people have probably pushed those timelines up, have left earlier than what they would, which is leaving a leadership vacuum from the people who understood, why procedures were in place. Why do we do things that seem silly sometimes? Why are we so repetitive in some of the security procedures we have? And the leadership that was there that taught the younger generation about that isn't there teaching them right now. Agencies are skimping on training at an amazing level. I've talked to some people in the last few weeks, and it blows my mind how much these agencies are skimping on training because they're short. I understand that. But would you rather be short staff and deal with that? Or would you rather run your staff through training, not giving them enough, and end up dealing with these escapes and lawsuits and all the stuff that we see in the news right now? That's how we stay out of the funny papers, is through training and through leadership. And so, I think a lot of that is what's going on right now. A couple of weeks ago, I think what really started this was, of course, the escape with Vicki White, who was a assistant supervisor at a county jail, and Casey White, an inmate who she'd apparently known for a couple of weeks. That turned into, I think it was an 11-day manhunt. And if you haven't listened, last episode I interviewed Toby Dorr, and Toby was a prison volunteer at Lansing State Prison where she ran a dog program. And she got herself in the same type of situation where she was manipulated and fell in love and eventually helped John Maynard escape. Took him out, right through the front door. They packed him up in a dog crate and she took him right past security. Security procedures weren't followed. And maybe we'll start there. Listening to Toby's story last week, really, you could pick out so many instances of where this could have been stopped, where the escape could have been stopped, where the manipulation could have been slowed down. She told several times listening to her talk, she talked about John Maynard, receiving extra attention from staff, was allowed to go places and do things that other inmates weren't allowed to do because he was manipulative or, had that way about him. So staff overlooked a lot of stuff. He seemed to a lot of staff like he was one of those inmates that's always a helper. So they gave him privileges that other inmates didn't get, which is exactly what allowed him to get in the position to start planning this escape. Put him in the position where he was able to more easily manipulate Toby Dorr. And then there were other breakdowns. Toby said herself that the day that they took him out in the dog crate, that it was 19 degrees outside, so nobody was in a real big hurry to stand outside in the 19-degree weather and go through all those dog cages in her van. And what happened was they didn't check the boxes. They didn't check through that van the way they should have, the way policy, I'm sure, stated they should, the way they'd been trained to do it. Complacency kicked in, and they wanted to get back inside the guard shack where it was warm, and took some shortcuts, and it cost. They allowed an inmate to escape out of their prison, which nothing's more embarrassing for a correctional officer, in my opinion. Anything can happen inside, and a lot of it's dangerous. But in order for inmates to escape, there has to be multiple breakdowns in policy and how policy is implemented, in the complacency of staff doing their jobs and following security procedures, and in the way security audits are being performed. Does that institution have regular security audits going on where they walk through, make sure that there's enough razor wire in the corners of the wall, that procedures are being followed, that inmates are being hands-on so that they can't move contraband? Because in all of these escape stories, they have very similar examples of what led to the escape. And it's those things. It's complacency. It's not following policy. It's manipulation. It's allowing inmates to do things they're not supposed to. So in each one of those cases, we're dealing with that. We'll back up and talk about Vicki White and Casey White. Apparently now that things have been found out after the escape was ended, apparently they knew each other. She knew him for about 2 years. She had fallen in love with him, or whatever feelings she had, and had been manipulating staff for a long time, getting around the rules so that she could see him and be in his area, which I've seen that happen before. She was able to visit and write him under assumed names. But, after they escaped, within, 24, 48 hours, during the investigation, there were many inmates who came forward and said that she'd been giving him special treatment for years. She'd been giving him extra trays. She'd been letting him do stuff that other inmates weren't allowed to do. So the inmates were well aware of this. You can't tell me that the other staff weren't well aware of this, or that they weren't doing the same thing. And the security procedures that were ignored the day they escaped. She's retiring. It's her last day. She walks into a, whatever it is, an R&D or a receiving and discharge area with this inmate, and apparently tells the other staff down there that she's taking him out for a mental evaluation for the court, and walks out the door. And to this day, I can't wait to read the investigation when it's done. I hope they do publish it, because I cannot imagine being the person working R&D and going, oh, okay, well, we'll see you later. We don't have any paperwork. You should have another officer with you. Since that's a male inmate, you should have a male inmate with you in case he needs to be visually searched. All of these things. And those were all ignored because she was a supervisor. I understand that she was a supervisor, but being a supervisor in prison doesn't give you the right to break rules. It doesn't give you the right to go around policy. And how that didn't fly a flag for staff to step up and say, hold it. No, we need to talk to somebody else. You're going to have to show me some paperwork. You're going to have to show me, you're going to have to escort him in a proper way with another staff member. I read some comments the other day, and I think the people are absolutely right. Not only was the inmate probably a manipulator, but Vicki White has to be one of the best manipulators ever. She was given an Employee of the Month or Employee of the Year several times. She was, from what everyone says, a model correctional officer, a model employee. All of her co-workers and everybody at the sheriff's department says they had respect for her. So for her to carry all that out, and for her to get by and fool everybody at that level, she must have been a heck of a manipulator too. But, that ended with her and him 11 days on the run. They had a car wreck, and I don't know if they were pushed off the highway or not, but they ended up in a car wreck there, and she ended up committing suicide in order to keep from having to, go and pay the consequences for what all she'd done. He's back in jail. Casey White's back in jail, and I'm sure picking up extra charges and put in a more secure unit by this time. But just a wild story. But it's not the only story. The more you go and look at these, if you're interested sometime, there's a report online about the escape in Elmira, New York. Now, there's several things that I got out of reading that report, and this is an after-action report. And I am doing some Monday morning quarterbacking here. I'm not walking in the shoes of these people, but some of the things I'm talking about are inexcusable, and I don't have to be there in order to say that they were wrong. And once again, with the escape at Elmira, there were several instances where staff complacency aided the escape. No one was found guilty of actually stepping up and being part of the escape, but some of the things that staff did directly, in my opinion, allowed for the escape. Policy talked about not letting inmates paint their own cells. I've seen this in some of the prisons I've worked in, but that was a rule that they allowed them to paint their cell. Well, what they did was bring back paint from the paint shop and painted the ceiling black, and nobody seemed to worry about that. Of course, it made that cell darker, harder to see in, but it also disguised where they were chipping away at the concrete in the ceiling, and they were able to cover it up with a black piece of cardboard, I think. So, there's one instance. The fact that one of the things I found very interesting was a doorstop that some staff had said had been there for 15 years, and it was part of a sledgehammer head. And this sledgehammer head had been used as a doorstop in the VOTEC or technical area for many, many years. Staff and inmates walked by it daily. And in all that time, no staff ever looked at that and said, wow, that's something we should dispose of because an inmate could use that. I mean, if not for escape, nobody wants to get hit in the head with a 6-pound sledgehammer head. But one day that ended up disappearing. Staff noticed it, but nobody reported it. Nobody looked for it. So tool control right there is just that's unspeakable. For staff to walk past that many times and not do anything about it and not say anything when they noticed it missing. But tool control was a problem all throughout that report. They had a VOTEC, much like I talked about with John Maynard at Lansing. They had an inmate who was very congenial, and staff liked him, and especially one of the staff members who was over the VOTEC area. And he would give him special privileges, would let him go back to the house early in between moves, which what this did was allow him to put stuff in his pockets and carry stuff back to the housing unit without having to go through as many pat-downs and have a better chance, because they knew when they were going to get patted down. They're going to get patted down during movement mostly, which is the reason why inmates shouldn't move except during movement. But that was one of the ways that they carried back a bunch of screws that they were able to chip through the concrete with, and that hammerhead, and the paint to paint their cell. And all of this was staff complacency. They were found not liable for the escape, but in some ways, I believe they absolutely were. But if you get the chance, that report's online, The Escape from Elmira, New York, and it's quite a read. It goes from beginning to end on how that started and how it ended. One that's been in the media lately is The Escape from Dannemora, and that movie, if it's on Netflix, the movie's okay. Of course, they portray the correctional staff as dumb and portray us as not knowing what's really going on in that prison. And apparently there were some staff like that, but not all staff are like that in our prisons, even though that's the way we're portrayed. But anyway, in that movie, they show several ways. Another staff member who worked in the sewing area, and I guess where they made it like inmate uniforms and stuff, or tailored them, whatever they did there. And she began to get along and have this favorite inmate, this special inmate, and started giving him favors, and eventually that led to sex, which eventually led to, her possibly helping them escape, bringing things in for them to escape. I don't remember how much time she got, but she actually did bring in contraband, I believe some saw blades in order to help them escape. But the other thing they show in there was a housing unit officer who was helping one of the inmates hide some art projects and some art instruments that he wasn't supposed to have during shakedowns. So he allowed him to hide those in the pipe chase. Well, his time in the pipe chase, the inmate's time in the pipe chase, is why he was able to see how they could escape there and where, the escape possibilities were from that building out onto the roof. But that's why some of those security policies are there. Inmates shouldn't have access to certain areas of the institution. Even your inmates that you have on maintenance crews, if it's up to me, they should be verified by your investigative services, whatever that shop is for your agency. You need to have inmates who don't have a history of escape if they're going to be working on the HVAC crew. If they're going to be working on the plumbing crew. We don't want inmates who have a history of escape. Now, that doesn't stop everything, but it's good, solid correctional judgment not to give them access to seeing how the institution's laid out, or possibly, have access to areas that could allow them to escape. So, I guess the big one in the news right now is this inmate in Texas, Gonzalo Lopez, serving a sentence in Texas for killing a man with a pickaxe. So apparently they were taking him for a medical appointment along with some other inmates on a bus. And although I've read through a bunch of the stories, I don't understand how some of the things have happened. The only thing they say is that somehow he was able to free himself of his restraints. The thing I'm going to say about that is, were those restraints put on correctly? Were they checked by two people? Were they make sure that they're deadlocked? And don't get me wrong, restraints are only as good as the officer supervising them, because it's pretty quick, and anybody that's worked in prison for a while can show you, you can get out of restraints pretty quick. But making sure they're deadlocked, making sure that they fit correctly and that they're put on correctly goes a long ways with that. It also says at some point he was able to cut through the steel mesh, and I've read where he was in a cage, and then I've read where he got into the cage where the driver was by cutting through the steel mesh. Well, that flies huge flags to me. How does an inmate have something that's going to cut through steel mesh that quickly, that hasn't alerted people to the problem? There's just, I don't know, there's some big red flags there. I'd love to know more about that. Anyway, he was able to stab the driver, and they got in a fight. The driver got stabbed. He ended up getting in the bus. From what I read, probably the jump seat officer, the one in the back, was able to get out, maybe shot one of the tires or both, and then the inmate crashed with the bus about a mile away and was able to flee into the woods. So I don't know the story there, and I hate to be that Monday morning quarterback, but there has to be more to that story. There's some security procedures that are really lax in order for that to happen. Another one that just came off of the kind of the news is these 3 juveniles who were, and they're recaptured, but they apparently escaped. I haven't been able to find out a whole lot about how they escaped, but they believe that there was a getaway car driven by a security guard who allegedly, helped them. So once again, we have someone who is helping these prisoners escape. And there could be more to that story. That could be another case of I fell in love with an inmate, or it could be a case of we've had staff who are hired on with the complete intent of helping the inmates inside. Basically, they're part of a gang or, you know, related to these inmates, and they actually come get jobs in our correctional centers, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that we don't lower our expectations when hiring. We still need to be hiring the best of the best. You know, filling a job for 8 hours, I understand it. I've been there, but we've got to be careful with that. You know, one of the escapes that I remember several years ago was the, I don't remember what year that was. What year was that? Was it 2012, 2013? A couple of inmates escaped from the high-rise in Chicago, the federal MCC. And, you know, that was another example of complacency on staff's part. Staff were not doing their security checks. You know, bar taps had been signed off on. I know you guys do bar taps, but are we doing the bar taps correctly? You know, when you're taking that mallet and you're walking around to the bars and the bars on the windows, you're listening for sound. You're listening to hear a tink, 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 dunk. And when you hear that different sound, that means that bar has been cut or has been tampered with or has a problem. And, you know, bar taps were something that we did for years and years. And I think over the, as our jails have modernized, I don't think bar taps are as considered as big a security procedure as they used to be. You know, I can't help it, I started off at an old prison. You know, Missouri State Pen was all bars. Leavenworth had a lot of bars. Bar taps were a regular thing that we did. It was an important part of our job. And are they still getting done? Do we have supervisors ensuring that staff are doing those bar taps in the manner that they're supposed to and as often as they're supposed to? But in that Chicago escape, I mean, that was one of the issues there was the bar taps weren't being done. They'd been cutting through that window. They'd also, once again, smuggled some rubber material that allowed them to squeeze past the sharp pieces of metal. But the thing that speaks the most is, I forget what they were, 15 stories up, and they tied sheets together. How many sheets does an inmate need in his cell? 1, maybe 2. Okay. 2 sheets and a blanket. That's about the most an inmate should have in their cell. These inmates had 30, 40. I mean, how many sheets does it take to scale down 15 stories on the outside of a building? How did they get that many sheets? Well, that's because staff weren't doing the security checks and the cell searches that they should be. Or if they were doing them, they weren't doing them correct, which is the same thing in my book. You know, a cell search, and I tell people this all the time. When you go in a cell, you're not just looking for a big bag of hooch under the bed. You're looking for small stuff. You're looking for nuisance contraband, because all nuisance contraband turns into problematic contraband down the road. You know, what looks like a rubber band or 6 or 7 rubber bands hanging on a paper clip on the inside of that locker may not seem like a big deal until they take a piece of fence wire and then they take those 6 rubber bands and they wrap them around there and make a handle, you know, that allows you to hold on to that shank even when it gets bloody. Yeah, it's just 6 rubber bands until they make it into something else. Yeah, it's just 30 sheets that they've got folded up and used for a pillow because they want a second pillow, until they tie them all together and string them up down the side of a building so that they can climb out through the window. Cell searches are something that we have to stay on. They're something that we have to do on a regular basis. And my rule is, if I walk in a cell, I walk out with something. You should never, I used to see the log books where we did our cell searches, and, you know, you'd go down through there and you'd see where somebody had searched, nothing found, nothing found, nothing found. Really? There is no inmate in any prison anywhere that does not have contraband in their cell. And if you're leaving it in there, you're leaving it in there for them to put it to some nefarious use later on down the road. So you've got to take stuff. You take something every time you come out of that cell. Another reason why I believe that is because that also tells that inmate who's running the prison. This is our prison. You're not going to come in here and stack this stuff up in a cell. You're not going to keep old food in here. You're not going to brew hooch. You're not going to make weapons with the stuff that we leave laying around in the trash. We're going to take that stuff, and we're going to take it out of those areas so that they can't use it, so that they can't utilize it for, even if it's not an escape, it can be utilized for so much other stuff. But as you can see just from the examples I've brought up, all of these escapes, even though we don't know everything about some of them, we know that there are things they have in common when an inmate escapes. And one of them is that some type of manipulation has happened. Whether they went all the way to the point to where, they've fallen in love and they're willing to sell their house and take them across the country on a trip to a gunfight with the police, or whether it's just the manipulation that allows them to get black paint from the paint shop and get it back to their cell without getting pat searched. Whichever form of manipulation it is, it all leads to the same place. The other thing all of these situations have in common, all of these escapes have in common, is security procedures have been ignored. Policies been ignored. People have, for whatever reason, I've been tired at work. I haven't felt like doing stuff at work. I understand that. But you have to do it. You have to do it the same way every day. You have to get down with the mirror and look under that car coming through the rear gate. Every car. Not just the ones you want to, and not just the ones when it's sunny and 60 degrees. When it's 19 degrees outside and somebody's pulling out with the dog volunteers pulling out with a van full of dog crates, you've got to go through that car. You got to lift everything up, pull it out, go through it, make sure that there's no inmate in there. Those security procedures are in place for a reason. And most of the time, I can't quote directly, but I'll bet most of the time the security procedures that you're dealing with at work that are written down are there because it's already happened once. Corrections and prisons have been around for a long time. We learn from our mistakes, and we write policies, and we write procedures, and we get better. But in order to prevent that, we have to learn from our history. And all of these security procedures come from somewhere in history. Whether it was an escape, or whether it was an attempted escape, or whether it was just staff who saw this could lead that way. So it's so important that we follow those. And then the final one, and I don't know, there's no way to measure this, but the fact that we're having problems with recruiting and retention and this leadership vacuum from the staff that are going on and retiring or moving out of corrections, there's no way to measure that, but all of that has an impact on why these things are happening, and the only thing we can do to combat that is to be vigilant. I was told early in my career, and I may have told this story on the podcast before, but it really changed the way I did things. I was doing a pat search, and one of the older staff walked over and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing a pat search." And I'm standing there, and inmates are going through the line, and I'm patting them quick as I can, moving them on. He said, "What are you pat searching for? Watermelons? Because that's about the only thing you're going to find with the way you're doing a pat search." He said, "If you want to do a pat search, take your time. Get in the corners of their pockets. Be detailed in what you do." He said, "You will find more stuff with one good pat search that takes a minute or two than you will with 20 pat searches that take a few seconds." And that's just something I always remembered. And it did change the way I found stuff It did change the contraband that I was stopping from going in the housing unit. I went from finding big nuisance contraband to actually being able to find drugs and weapons, contraband that was being used to make weapons. But that really changed the way I did my job. I tried to become more methodical and thoughtful and understood what I was after. Not just after something. I was after drugs. I was after weapons. I was looking in the places that they were. Not just looking until I found one, but learning to look where they were. Learning to think like an inmate. You know, I think there's a saying out there on the firing range, aim small, miss small. Well, I think the same thing goes for your pat searches and your visual searches. If you're looking for small stuff, you're going to find small stuff and big stuff. If you're just looking for big stuff, that's all you're going to find is when they try to get a watermelon out of the food service area. So those are just my thoughts, my ideas. I really do hate seeing all of these escapes in the news. It's embarrassing for corrections. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that goes on inside that inmates get by with, inmates manipulate us with. But once they get outside the fence and it's in the public and everybody sees that complacency, that lack of following security procedures led to an inmate getting out, that's our one job. Keeping them inside the fence, keeping them behind the wall. And I think that's our duty. I think it's the highest level of service that we can give the public is keeping them inside that fence. There's going to be stuff that goes on inside the fence. There's going to be gangs. There's going to be weapons. There's going to be fights and assaults and hooch making and all the stuff that goes on in prison. But our highest duty is to keep them inside the fence at the end of the day, to keep the public safe. So how do we stop these escapes? What is it that we need to do? It all falls back to the same thing. We've got to stop the inmate manipulation. We've got to stop allowing the inmate manipulation. One of the things that used to just burn me up when I used to work SEG, we'd get over the weekend, we'd get an inmate locked up for something, and Monday morning, I'd have whoever his boss was as an orderly or a teacher or whatever, they'd be on the phone with me and say, "Hey, what have you got my inmate locked up for?" And I'd say, "Your inmate?" At any moment during your career, if you think an inmate belongs to you because you need them to do a job, if at any time during your career you think one inmate is better than another inmate in your area where they work, you need to stop and you need to reflect on that, because they're not. Inmates are inmates. Are some more skillful in some areas than others? Absolutely. But your job as a correctional professional is be able to take that inmate over there and teach him how to mop the floor. And then that inmate over there and teach him how to mop the floor. And be able to teach him to take out the trash. And be able to do those things. Inmates, when you start thinking that when you start thinking that one inmate is better than the other inmate, this is a warning sign of manipulation. You are either being manipulated, you have been manipulated, or you're going to be manipulated. Inmates are inmates. Your job is to teach them how to mop a floor and take out the trash. Your job is to treat them the same, fair and consistent. So don't ever get in the position that you think that's your inmate, or I need that inmate in my area because he's the only one that can do that job. In all of these instances of these escapes that happen with VOTEC teachers and stuff, that is exactly what happened. Even Toby Dorr, a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed her, mentioned that John Maynard was waiting for her and he was allowed to be there the whole time. At times she felt like he was her protector. But hopefully I'm able to shed some light onto how these escapes are happening. They all have the same things in common. That doesn't change. It's never changed. I've been on a lot of escapes in my career, and those escapes started out the same way.